Hey everyone, Kara here right at the top of the show this week to remind you about that time when we had J.R. Becker on as a podcast guest. He's the author of our favorite children's book series, Annabelle and Aiden. Well, he just released a new book celebrating scientific discovery and critical thinking over magical assumptions. It's satirically called It's Got to Be Magic, and the Kickstarter campaign just launched this morning. You can pre-order the book and even get your name or photos in it. All you've got to do is visit itsgottoBeMagic.com. Again, pre-orders opened this morning for a limited time only at itsgottoBeMagic.com. Help support independent science authors and pre-order a book today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 12th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Kara Santa Maria. I'm just realizing today is the 550th episode. I like those round numbers. I cannot believe that. It started way back in 2014. Now we're on episode 550. Y'all are awesome for sticking with us this long. So I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, from the beginning, this show has been free to download. I'm never going to charge for the show. The way that we keep it going, because ad sales are minimal. Although I did read an ad today. It's the first time in a long time. It's mostly just Patreon. That's really the main funding source for the show lately. So if you're interested in pledging your support, throwing a few bucks our way and sort of offsetting that cost so that folks who can't afford to pay never have to, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy, where you can learn more. That's patreon.com/talknerdy. Sorry, I'm a teeny tiny bit jet lagged. I've been out of the country for the last month, traveling in Asia. I pre-recorded all the intros for last month's worth of episodes. So this is the first time I'm recording since I got back. But yeah, let's thank those of you who do make Talk Nerdy possible. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, sorry, Gabrielle, Joe Wilkinson, or maybe you go by Gabriel. This whole time I've said Gabrielle. Maybe you're Gabriel. Gosh. Let me know. Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, let's get into it. So this week I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Karen G. Lloyd. She's the Wrigley Chair in Environmental Studies and Professor of Earth Sciences at the University of Southern California. And she has published both in Nature and Science. These are two of the leading publications in the sciences. So that's a pretty big deal, you all. And she has a new book out. It's called Intraterrestrials, Discovering the Strangest Life on Earth. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Karen G. Lloyd. Well, Karen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So I'm excited to talk about your work and also your new book, your first book, Intraterrestrials, Discovering the Strangest Life on Earth. So before we even get into what is an intraterrestrial, let's talk a little bit about you and your work. I mean, you are a scientist and you are working in the department of, are you in where?
I'm in an earth sciences department. I actually spent the first 12 years of being a professor in a microbiology department.
Gotcha.
And then I switched to earth sciences, which is the intersection of those two things is my sweet spot.
I love that. So then I'm curious, what did you study to get there? Do you have degrees in both of those fields?
No, I have degrees in neither of those fields.
Love it.
I have no degrees in biology. I have my undergraduate degree is technically biochemistry, but it was Swarthmore College, so it's not like a big university. It's a small liberal arts university, our college, and so it was really a chemistry major with a sprinkling of some biochemistry on top.
Right.
And then my master's and PhD are in marine sciences, or oceanography is another way to call that.
Oh, very cool. And so what got you focused specifically in marine science? I remember taking an oceanography course in my undergrad and being like, I don't think this is what I thought oceanography was. I
Yeah.
was like, we're talking a lot about ocean currents.
Yeah, I have to teach that class and it hits people pretty hard. They're like, where are the dolphins? Same for the penguins and the polar bears. Yeah, it's. I grew up on the coast of North Carolina, like right in the shadow of the Duke University Marine Lab and the North Carolina State Marine Lab and the University of North Carolina Marine Lab. So they did like but I'm basically the product of like outreach. You know, they would always do like little like outreach activities for the local kids. So I never had the impression that oceanography was just whales and dolphins. Like I had always been learning about the chemistry of oceans since I was a little kiddo. But
I love that.
yeah.
And so how then did you grow into a more, I guess, biological lens or biological frame, given that your interest area and your training was not, I guess, bio-focused per se?
I did a summer program at the North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina. And there was a professor there, John Mayfield, who just like opened my eyes to the world of microbiology. So I sort of credit him with that. Of course, I had many, many mentors who really enriched that quite a bit. But I sort of had that trajectory in my head. I'm going to be a microbiologist because there's this crazy hidden world, like doing these powerful things, and we don't know anything about it. Blah, you know, I need to do that. And then I went to college to be a microbiologist, and I started taking chemistry, and I was like, actually, I got to do chemistry because this is mind blowing. It was just like putting puzzles together. And I had such a good time with it that I just decided to major in chemistry. I was like, I'll do biology later. I need to do this now.
Well, and I can't help but feel like, you know, we are living in an era where it's going to sound strange to say like we know so much because obviously there's so much yet to learn. But when I think about science historically, especially kind of like what we think of as sort of classical Western science, historically, it could afford to be siloed because there were so many unanswered questions within their silos. But I feel like the new frontier of science is interdisciplinary. It's not how does this one thing work? It's how does this work in the context of all these other things?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, that's where my interests lie because, you know, you can't to take something, you know, the physics example is imagine a spherical cow. You know, we all had to do this in our physics classes, and it sure makes your distance, velocity, acceleration, time equations work great. But is it reality? And so that's how I'm treating microbiology is can I study microbes in the wild, in the messy, weird places that they live with all their friends and enemies, as opposed to the nice, clean, perfect conditions that we normally look at in lab of a pure culture.
Yeah, and what an important point to make that when we're talking about especially microorganisms, it's probably still pretty rare to study them in situ. Like mostly even biomedical research is like take a culture and then do stuff to it in a petri dish.
Absolutely. I mean, I would argue that the medical field has picked up a lot from environmental microbiologists over the years. I mean, just look at the explosion in studies in gut microbiome stuff. They're using a lot of the techniques that were developed working in environmental systems and soil sciences and agricultural work.
Absolutely. And so when you are doing your research and you're specifically looking at these organisms within their natural environments, their kind of the full sort of ecological picture, where do you tend to look? Because there's stuff everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I tend to focus on the subsurface of Earth. Just to me, it feels very much like a frontier, like exploration. It's really hard to sample inside the Earth. You know, depending on where you are and what kind of capabilities you have, it's always a challenge. So no matter what we find, it's always exciting if it's hard to get to.
Yeah, yeah. So how do we define subsurface?
We don't have a definition, like emphatically not. I'm pretty loose with my definition. Pretty much anything that doesn't regularly see the sun for me is good enough. So, you know, just reach down. If you're standing like on a stinky mud flat and your feet sink in, you know, a little bit, I would call that the subsurface.
Right, right. So it could be either just right there or it could be pretty deep. It could be like ocean floor or
below the ocean floor.
Yeah. Oh, below the ocean floor. Okay. So even ocean floor, does that count? So does the deep ocean count as subsurface? That's confusing.
I don't
Okay.
call the deep ocean subsurface, although you kind of could, just because it's, you can have big animals there. You have lots of oxygen. It's still mysterious and wonderful. And I'm just not a person who studies the animals in the deep ocean,
Yeah.
but I go to the deep ocean to basically have that be my roof of where I'm going to work. And then I
Gotcha.
go down from there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so when we're talking about these sort of extreme places, do you find that the subsurface, which as we just described is so multifaceted, and sometimes it's under the ocean floor, sometimes it's terrestrial, do you find that there are similar features in terms of, like, I don't know, pressure or temperature or the types of elements that you see in these places?
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of similarities in all the different places. I mean, one thing is pressure is something that affects everything that's deep. It's sort of
Mm-hmm.
unavoidable. And it's also something that's really hard to recreate in laboratories. I'm not saying it's impossible. Of course, we have pressure vessels, and I've done lots of work under high pressure, and we can even go to extremely high pressures with like diamond anvils, but it's a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
So it's like we can do it, but we don't do it a lot. So I sort of obviate all that by just not trying to recreate it so much in lab and just going straight to the source.
And so are you actually doing experiments in these regions? Like, how are you able to do science in a place that it's hard enough just to get to for a sample?
So there's I personally have two approaches to it. One is to take that sample from wherever it is, that hard to get to place, and then I basically measure everything I can think of and can measure in terms of chemistry, biological molecules like RNA, DNA, proteins, small metabolites, lipids, if I can get them, just all the pieces that make up all the individual cells. And then I try to recreate that world and infer what they were doing before I took them out of that system. So that's sort of the go out to nature approach. And when I do run experiments in laboratory, they're experiments that are maybe a little uncontrolled. I think there's probably a lot of scientists who would just like be horrified at just like how messy, uncontrolled my stuff is. I mean, not that I don't run controls, but like I'll do things like take natural mud from an estuary and just put it into a vessel and just watch it over time, watch the gases over time, watch the microbes over time. I don't feed it. I don't try to push it in a direction. I don't poke it to see what happens, but I've got it sitting on my lab bench and I just passively watch it to see what it does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh, that's interesting. And so you've got a pretty big lab right now. How would you define, or how are like most of your students in your lab categorized? Are they all from the same department, or is it a pretty multidisciplinary lab?
Well, I've got folks still. I just moved from the University of Tennessee to the University of Southern California, so I have students in both places, which is like kind of a juggle.
Yeah,
I'm a firm believer that everyone in my lab is the master of their own domain. Like they each have a project that they know is theirs. And I think that really helps them collaborate with each other because, you never worry that so-and-so is like stealing your stuff or, kind of doing your project for you. You know that it's yours and they've got theirs and everybody's plates are full. So nobody is like taking on anybody else's stuff. I really, that their ability to help each other is probably like the thing I appreciate the most about my lab members. It's wonderful. But they're all doing things.
Do they run the gamut? Like, do you have undergrads in your lab all the way up to postdocs?
Yep. Undergrads, well, I don't have anybody getting a master's right now. PhD students and postdocs.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about some of the types of questions that are being asked in your lab.
Yeah, they kind of break down into deep ocean methane questions. So I'm collaborating with a group, Chris Martin's group at the University of North Carolina, and they have these awesome deep sea landers that will measure rates of methane oxidation in situ without removing anything from the system. So it's part of this going into the wild and not abstracting everything. We're the only people in the world who can do this. So it's really exciting to be able to make these measurements actually in the deep sea. So I'm doing the microbiology along with that, and I have students associated with that project. I have another project looking at mud volcanoes in the Marianas Forearc. So the Marianas Trench, the like super deep deepest
Yeah.
part of the ocean. The reason that's so deep is that the Pacific plate is basically like running into the other plate, and it pulls things down super deep into this trench. But after Pacific plate goes down, it then basically, as it rides underneath the overriding plate, it pushes up a bunch of mud and muck and causes this reaction that makes a bunch of alkalinity, and this mud comes up at pH 12. And so then we go down with submersibles and sample it.
Wow.
So that's another project. And then I have another project that is up in the Arctic. So looking at the role of permafrost in not just climate change, but also just sort of extremophiles and how they live. The Arctic is a really fascinating place to work because it is changing so rapidly. It also can be very depressing, but just because it's sad that the glaciers are retreating doesn't mean that we shouldn't study them. So we are looking at how organic matter that gets released from thawing permafrost gets degraded either on land when it gets thawed or as it gets moved out to sea. We're looking at it, we're following it as it moves out to sea in the melting glaciers. And the question is that stuff going to turn back into greenhouse gases and cause further climate change, or is it going to just kind of get sequestered and kind of be okay?
Yeah, it's interesting when we think about sort of the big questions, the hypotheses, when describing these different areas of inquiry, that some of them, they do have these sort of large, I guess, global, like, is this going to contribute to climate change? Is this, a runaway feedback loop? Or is this something that's going to, have this kind of impact downstream? But very often in science, the questions may feel small, but we don't really know the ultimate impact, right? Like some of the questions, it sounds like your lab or your students are asking, not that they feel small, but they're like, here's a thing that we don't really know much about. Let's learn more about it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, each person is working on a kind of a narrow window, but if you pick a window that is sufficiently looking at something that's sufficiently unknown, it kind of doesn't matter what you discover as long as you discover it.
Yeah. And that sort of takes us to the title and really like the theme, right, of this book, Intraterrestrials. Obviously, it's quite a provocative title because I'm assuming that what you're referencing here is that we have things on our own planet that are very alien to us still.
That is how I feel.
Yeah.
And not to knock the extraterrestrials. I mean, I love an alien as much as anybody else, but we have so much mystery that's right here that I can get at. I can reach into it with my own hands.
And it's odd, right? And the reason it's odd is because these are places on the earth with extreme, shall we say, environmental pressures. I think about the fact that whether we're talking about narrative nonfiction, whether we're talking about a conversation between two people in a podcast, or whether we're actually talking about scientific inquiry, there is always a very specific kind of anthropocentric bias. I think we try to work against that, especially in laboratories where, we're not studying, let's say, human beings or even larger kind of animals. But we think about like, evolution and, all of these different like environmental pressures. And it's like really hard to remove the human lens from it. Like that place is weird because it's not like my place.
Yeah.
And my place is normal and that is weird.
Yeah.
But these aren't weird places. They're totally normal for the organisms that live there.
Yeah. I mean, humans have only been here for like a couple tens of millions of years or something like that. So we're weird. We just showed up.
Right. And some of these places that you study may be more like the early conditions on Earth, which we think of as weird, but we're actually, by definition, not weird. They're just the way things were.
And all this stuff. I mean, I think it's correct to always look at things with our human lens because, well, we don't have a choice. We are humans.
Right.
But it's also fine. Like we shouldn't feel guilty about looking for ways to enrich ourselves from what we learn. I don't mean financially necessarily. I mean, just like to better our society from this stuff. But I think that by having the freedom to do the kind of work that we're doing where we are not looking for a product. We are not improving a profit margin for a company. Like we don't have that requirement. It's just absolute blue sky. What can you discover that's new? That is what pushes us into the big discoveries that do help humanity.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I feel like from a political perspective, depending on the cross section of time that we're in, very often there is the other interpretation of that word enriching. You know, it's like, oh, your research sounds so interesting. You're going to these really kind of dramatic places. Ooh, what could you find there that we could extract and make money off of? You know, and it just does feel like in order, I mean, I'm not saying it's completely become the case right now, but I do worry that that's the goal here is like, prove to me that your research will somehow have an ROI that's not an ROI that has anything to do with humanity or, you know, knowledge or access to information. But like, how can we
means return on investment? Is that right?
Yep. Like if I sort of like put tax dollars towards this research, ultimately, what kinds of products are we going to get out of it that we can sell and slap a Made in America sticker on it?
Yeah.
And that's a bummer.
It's to me, it's not a bummer if you just say, we're not going to dictate the direction you go in, but it's okay to swoop in and make a profit later. That is fine. Like that is actually something I hope will happen from things that we discover in my own research. But the inverse of that you just said, where justify exactly what you think that profit's going to be before you even do the discovery, that's not discovery.
Right.
That's not actually pushing things forward. It's very limiting, and it's going to limit our ability to make a profit later. So scientists really need freedom. We're not doing piddly little things. We need the freedom to ask the big questions without knowing what the profit's going to be.
Absolutely. And I think that functioning in a sort of profit-seeking model where the outcome is defined before the investigation, it just breeds academic dishonesty. It breeds p-hacking. It breeds, even if it's not that overt, just motivated reasoning, right? Like this thing over here matters, so I'm going to put my effort over here, and I'm going to ignore that thing over there because it doesn't matter, because it doesn't have like a capitalist kind of price tag attached to it.
I have been so lucky to get to spend my whole career up to this point just absolutely doing blue sky work.
Yeah.
Asking questions because they're big questions and because they're hard to answer. And that has been my whole rationale for what I've done. And I am going to continue doing that until I can't.
Right. And I mean, right now we're recording this episode in April. It's not going to air for, I think, a few weeks, right? Because we want to link it with like about a month or so, because we want to link it with when the book is released. So I'm even, by the time this comes out, what we're saying may have become drastically worse, I hate to say. But like, how has your work been affected so far? Is it more sort of existential and, like fear of the unknown future that you're facing? Or have you actually seen policy changes affecting your work today?
I have had to change like how I talk about inclusion of people into science. And that's kind of frustrating because the whole point of DEI initiatives was to decrease bias, was to make meritocracy. The point is to not use your preconceived notions to judge someone negatively. That's the point of DEI. The point was about getting us more to actually examining people's merits rather than something that you invent from your culture. So that just confuses me that to remove DEI since it's farther from a meritocracy in my mind.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's kind of like cosmetic a bit. I think the big thing that's going to hit us is going to be the huge proposal to decrease science funding in the United States. And I was actually affected before the new administration because the JOIDES resolution, which is the workhorse drill ship for the whole world, the United States was a leader in deep ocean drilling, and we have been since the 60s. And we have maintained that position through the maintenance of these good working ships. We just have one. This isn't like a huge amount of our federal budget, but we have been that. So that ship has sunset and it is no longer operational, and there are no plans to replace it. Japan has their own ship, which works sort of in the vicinity of Japan. It's sort of the way that the ship is staffed. It has to be within a helicopter flight from Japan at all times. And China has just recently built a new ship that would replace the Lloyd Resolution. So China's going to lead this now. And Europe is also still continuing on their exploration. But the United States has, I don't know if it was a conscious decision or how it's happening, but we're not in the game anymore. We're not doing it anymore. So we're just
It's such a bizarre point of pride to be like, we don't spend money on things that will help us be innovative. And instead, we will watch these countries that, I mean, ostensibly, the administration right now is like kind of in a pissing match with China. So it's like, why would you? It's very strange reasoning.
That stuff is outside of my area of expertise, so I don't really understand it. But what is in my area of expertise is that we used to be a leader in deep ocean drilling, and we are currently not, and other people are. And that is the fact. The other thing that's coming up is these cuts to scientific funding. That's really going to hit me hard. I mean, that's how we do this innovation, is through federal grants for the most part.
Right. We have to. I mean, it cannot be, everything in the world cannot be a direct, unfettered, like laissez-faire capitalist endeavor. It just doesn't work that way. Like, we need to be able to fund things publicly because we know that they will improve the greater good. And it may not happen tomorrow. It may happen in a decade or in 100 years. But ultimately, I think any large scale investigation does show that investing in science pays back massive dividends.
Absolutely.
Massive.
And that's really helped our position in this country over the past 75 years. So that's all hitting us. Materially, I haven't felt it so much, but except for the lack of the ship. That's right. There are proposals I would have written. There are expeditions I would have done that I cannot do because we don't have a ship. And I can't write a proposal to work on the Chinese ship because it doesn't work like that.
Right. And then does that mean not just that there are expositions and investigations that you cannot do, but that there is like straight up science that can't be done?
There's currently science that is not happening because of this.
Yeah, that's such a bummer.
It's such a bummer. But I'm encouraged by the Chinese stuff. I have lots of really fantastic colleagues over there. So I'm really, that part is great. I love that China's getting in this game because they have such good science happening over there.
Speaking of the science, you sort of touched on a few specific. What's the overarching question that your lab asks?
We want to know how life inside Earth interacts with Earth processes.
So what is an example of an Earth process?
So in these subduction zones, like I was mentioning in the Mariana Trench, this is the only way that the surface of our Earth has a conversation with the mantle and eventually the core. That's sort of the inner parts of the Earth, is by these movements in the crust of bits of crust sinking and other bits of crust rising up. That moves things into the center part of our Earth. And so these evocative seams are basically places where you get mantle gases and deep Earth elements rising up to the surface. And it's becoming clear over time, although again, it's hard to do this, but it's becoming clear that we have a whole ecosystem inside Earth's crust that lives off of mantle gases, that lives off of the things that come up from the deep Earth. And it doesn't care about sunlight, and it doesn't depend on plants that have died and gotten buried. There are lots of places where those are important. I don't want to say those are not really important food sources for these ecosystems, but there are other ecosystems that really don't need those things at all, and they can just live inside Earth. And that has implications for our search for life elsewhere. Because as we look at the surfaces of the planets and the moons in our solar system, their surfaces do not look like very hospitable places. So we can just look at that and stop there and be like, yeah, that's it. No life there. But underneath their surfaces, they could have teeming populations of microbes sitting and doing all the wonderful things that ours are.
I'm curious, when did you first realize, or maybe when did it become common knowledge that like, wherever you go, Even in places that you think are the most hospitable, if you look hard enough, you're going to find something that's alive there. Like, because now that's sort of an understood thing,
Yeah.
but it wasn't always.
I think just on a personal level, I think I agree with you. I think that is absolutely a shift that has happened. Just on a very personal level, the first time I started sampling hot springs, there's another project that I have, sort of the last section of my projects is using natural, I say hot spring, but some of them are actually not very hot, but deeply sourced waters that get shoved up to the surface because of these continents pushing together that creates pressure and this stuff comes up. And the idea is that it brings with it the gases that are from the mantle and also whatever microbes that are down there get washed up to the surface and we catch them. And the first time I sampled this stuff was in Costa Rica in 2017. And I remember pushing all this water through a bunch of filters where I was hoping to catch the microbes in the filters, thinking, I'm filtering a bunch of sterile water. I'm not catching anything. This stuff is perfectly clear.
Yeah.
It's from the deep earth. Who could live down there? It's hot as hell. Like, there's no way I'm catching anything that's living in these filters. And I took them back to lab and we looked at their DNA and there's tons and tons of things there. It was a massive teeming ecosystem and I was completely wrong.
I love that. And so going back to this idea of sort of the weird, the bizarre, the alien, what kinds of adaptations, what kinds of differences in their sort of biochemistry or in their life cycle do we start to see as we look at, extremophiles, as we look at microbial life living in extreme conditions?
I think the most important thing to conceptualize is that when we think about our lives up here at the surface, we think of all the variety of plants and animals and slugs and sponges and all this stuff. But all of this variety that we see on the surface, we all breathe oxygen. It's like biochemically and metabolically, we're very, very simplistic on the surface. So as we talk about these things that live on or inside Earth's crust, they can breathe pretty much every metal on the periodic table. They can use iron like we use oxygen. They can, in solid iron, they can basically take a brick of manganese and breathe it. And they can get their electrons from, it's an electrical reaction that we basically do. We all do it inside inside of our bodies, but we use sugars, we use food, organic matter, and we put those electrons onto oxygen. But they can get their electrons from things that wouldn't look like food to us. So other metals, hydrogen, formate, methane, all these really simplistic compounds that really don't seem like food are food to them.
Right. So in some ways, they sort of feel like they're a bit breaking the rules of carbon-based life that at least we thought were the rules.
Yeah, that's how it feels. I mean, you have to this is one reason why I don't feel weird being a trained as a chemist for what I'm doing is that you just have to go to the rules of chemistry to figure out what the biology is doing. Because if you look at the rules of thermodynamics, you can look at every reaction that can happen. And if you know the conditions under which it happens, you can say, hey, that is a reaction that should give some energy that can be used as a respiration. Pretty much every time we've done that, someone has found a microbe that can do it, that can catalyze that reaction and get energy from it.
Which is incredible. And given that the sort of inputs and the outputs are so wildly different, even though it's still a respiratory process, I guess it leads me to the question that is often grappled with on this show when sort of astrobiologists join us on the show, which is how easy is it for you when you're looking at these extreme microbes to even identify them as living?
Oh, yeah. The question of living is always an interesting one. I have a very expansive definition of alive, metabolically active. So the cell doesn't necessarily have to divide or, proliferate in the way that you would expect it to in a laboratory. But I have to see some waste products coming out and some substrates going in. And if that and they have to maintain their bodies, they have to repair random breaks that happen to their genome. And as long as that's happening, it can happen over very long time scales. And I consider them to be, they are alive.
Yeah. And so some of these examples would be these microorganisms that live for hundreds of years or thousands of years.
As far as we can tell, again, this is really hard to prove because we can't run an experiment for thousands of years. But as far as we can tell, they live for tens of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years.
And so are they just sort of in a stasis state for most of that?
Relative to the way we see the world, yes, but
Yeah.
maybe not to them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. So it's quite a slow and still experience for some of these
Yeah.
organisms.
I mean, the way to think about it is just imagine that you're a little microbe sitting at the seafloor. The top of the seafloor is pretty active. You've got crabs crawling around, you've got like a bunch of fish blowing things around. But at some point, on average, you get pushed down below that point with all the stuff raining down on top. And once you're down past the reach of the animals, nothing really happens to you for about 1,000,000 years. 1,000,000 years is hard to conceptualize as a biologist, just thinking about life. Nothing we deal with is an organism that lives for longer than 1,000 years. So if you're in a state where nothing happens, then you don't need to do much.
Yeah, you don't gotta do much. And we have pretty good understandings of how long extant species have been extant. Not just, I mean, historically, right, let's say we're talking about like large animals,
Mm-hmm.
we would look at their specific features and say, oh, look at their hip, and it's like that other hip of these bones that I found, and oh, maybe it changed at this point because that's when we started finding their bones. But now we can look at the DNA, and the DNA tells us stories, right? It tells us like some at least amount of chronology.
Yeah. Yeah, a bit. It's hard to put dates on things that are that differentiated this long ago, because we don't have fossils. So I don't do a lot of saying exactly when groups diverged from each other, but the things that we're seeing, these sort of things that I'm calling intraterrestrials, I didn't invent that word, but I just find it to be a very useful word.
Yeah.
What we're finding is that it's not like we're not chasing like this one strange group that's managed to colonize this weird place. It looks like it's more like a bunch of deep branches on the tree of life.
Right. And pretty early on, these
Yeah.
branches are pretty, like they've conserved a lot of the stuff that we had back when we were in the soup.
Yeah, basically.
That's really interesting. So in some ways you are going back in time. Like, I know that they don't fossilize,
Right.
but when we throw the term around living fossils, which is kind of a meaningless term. But in some ways these kind of are living fossils.
Yeah. I mean, when I'm sampling something that's like 50,000 years old, it's possible that the cells that I can like pick up and like rub between my fingers, that actual living cell was alive for 50,000 years.
Yeah, like that's crazy. So we're not even just talking about the evolutionary past and not much changing and, kind of maintaining this organism's DNA, but we're talking about actual individual organisms living that long.
Like you don't talk about your grandfather evolving over his life.
Right.
He may live for 100 years, and that's amazing. And he's certainly experienced changes over those 100 years, but he's not evolving.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. That
It is.
I mean, how do we know? Like, I know we can't be fully sure, but how do we know that something's really, really old?
Yeah, so we have to always leave open the option that we're wrong, always. However, the evidence is stacking up and it's pretty good. So one way is that we can look at all the food sources that are available to these communities, and we can look at the rate. We know that the rate, we can measure the rate at which these sediments pile up on each other. So like it's like a recorder tape over time. And we can look at the rate of disappearance of the substrates that they're eating and the appearance of what they're making. And we can see from that rate that it is orders of magnitude too low to even get a single cell division.
Oh, wow.
So it's like we could be off in those estimates, but we would have to be wrong by like 10,000 fold to have it be enough. So basically, it's a really safe assumption that there's not enough power to actually go through mitosis and like split apart and like become two cells and, do all the stuff that we learned in biology class. Like that there's not enough power for that, basically. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that we see that the total number of microbial cells in these places, and I want to be clear, I'm just talking about marine sediments here.
Yeah.
There are other places within Earth's crust that have energy, so there could be growth in those places. But in these really still places in Earth's crust, we see the total number of cells decreasing over depth, over time. So there's no new big population surges unless something happens, which sometimes you have like an input of something from like a deep basalt, and that's pretty exciting too. But for the most part, they're just kind of like one is dying more slowly than the other.
Right, right. They're just kind of fizzling out because they don't have any energy source to keep holding on to.
I just want to give like the other piece of evidence to support this because it is an extraordinary conclusion. So you need to like really justify it. But some of my colleagues have put in chemically labeled substrates and then looked in real time to see how quickly these organisms eat them. And what they find is that they eat them extraordinarily slowly. And so it matches with what we say from theory.
Yeah. So super, super old, very, very slow and quiet, metabolizing weird things that we don't think of as metabolizable. What are some of the other features that you found that are just kind of bizarre and I don't know, like wow, that thing can be alive?
There's a kind of a new field popping up of not a new field, but a new area of study looking at a deeply branching group in the archaea we've been calling them Asgard archaeota because we didn't know what else to call them. And the first good genome from them came from a place that was called Loki's Castle in the mid-Atlantic ridge. And so we started naming them all Asgards. But Hiroyuki Armachi in Japan at Jamstack and Christa Schlepper in Austria, they have recently separately been cultivating these organisms, which my mind was blown when they first started doing this because I didn't know if these would ever be able to be grown in a laboratory. But they are being very careful and very patient and growing them in a laboratory. And because they've grown them, they can actually get images of them. And they are weird looking organisms. They are tiny, like a lot of these archaea that we see. They're about half the size of an E. coli cell. But they have these really long appendages. And did you ever learn the difference between like eukaryotes and prokaryotes in school? Is that something that
I did? Yeah, I remember. Like kind of the difference between if something has, I guess, a nucleus or not, or if it just has the ribosomes, or there were like different divisions that I remember learning back in the day. But my assumption is that they are blurrier than that.
It is. It's gotten very. I think I made like a little plate, a paper plate with I don't know what I did, like candy. I made a little cell with candy when I was a kid. One of the things you learn is that eukaryotes, that's our branch, that's all the multicellular things on Earth, we have organelles. So we have actually things that are like little cells within our cells, like mitochondria, and we have cytoskeletons. So we basically can have structure that these simple bags of goo can't have, these prokaryotes. Well, that's what we're finding in these archaea, these special weird Loki archaeota, Asgard archaeota things, is that they have the cytoskeleton that we have. So they can make structure, even though they're super, super tiny and super, super slow. These things divide, even in laboratory under perfect conditions. It takes them 2 weeks to make a new cell. These things are able to have these shapes that we never would have guessed that we'd have for something that tiny and slow.
That's fascinating. And so what kinds of pressures are they under?
You mean evolutionary or physical?
Physical, I guess physical, which becomes evolutionary over time. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't quite have a good idea about the role of pressure in the evolutionary drivers of this stuff. It's not something that I know enough about just yet.
But they are, I guess, physically in a pretty brutal place, right?
Brutal. I mean, when nothing happens.
Compared to what we can withstand, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's brutal being in a riverbed, getting knocked around with stones all the time. I mean, these guys, they can be pretty comfy. They don't have energy, but they just, they have predictability.
And it's probably pretty comfy just to be very, very small.
Yeah, you can avoid a lot of things. Yeah. And to be slow, nobody comes after you if you're not competing for things.
I never thought about that before. Just like being very, very small, very, very still, very, very slow, very quiet. You're just kind of experiencing the world, but you're not, I guess, salient to most things around you.
Yeah. I think a
Well,
lot
that's
of things
fascinating.
happen around them that they probably, well, if they could notice things that they don't notice.
Hmm. Yeah. Would it be a safe assumption that these kind of extreme microbes represent some of our earliest ancestors, or do you think that's too big of a stretch?
No, it's absolutely true as far as we can tell. So these ones
That's
that I'm
like,
talking about, it. Go ahead.
mhm. No, I was just gonna say that's crazy cool. It's like crazy cool to think that we have extant things right now, which are probably not that different than what we were
I know.
millions of years ago.
I've been calling
Yeah.
them grandma.
Yeah.
Like this one's
So
grandma.
cute.
It is. Well, so we this whole eukaryote thing, that's
Hmm.
us. That's a whole lot of things. It's a very evocative branch. Everything that we love is in the eukaryotes, all our families and everything, and koala bears. All of us have mitochondria, and we've long known. Lynn Margulis, I believe in the 70s, figured out that these mitochondria that we use to get energy contain DNA from an alpha proteobacterium. So we've long known that that organelle was not made by us as eukaryotes. It was engulfed or somehow taken on by our ancestor who ate or engulfed somehow a bacterium. And that is well established. We've known that for decades. But what we've never known is who did the engulfing. Who was the
Mm-hmm.
mama cell that took on the mitochondria and turned into elephants.
Yeah.
And this is it.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
That's like really, really cool.
Yeah.
Oh, and so how do you keep pushing the boundaries of this? I'm like, obviously you wrote this book. We were talking a little bit offline beforehand, and something that you mentioned, which I think is important to reiterate for the folks listening at home. You are not by trade a public science communicator. You are a
Nope.
working scientist who runs a lab, who
Yep.
is, in it all the time.
Yep.
But over years and years of doing this, you've amassed so much knowledge, and you were like, okay, I'm going to write a trade publication. Like, I'm not just going to keep publishing in journals. I mean, I am going to keep doing that, but in journals where only my colleagues can understand what we're talking about.
Right.
Let's make this accessible for folks. I guess first, how did you choose what to include in the book and like how to organize it? Did you work really hard with like an editor, or did you already have an idea of how you wanted to present this information?
Both of those are true. I both had an idea of the organization, and I worked heavily with many editors to try to organize it and not have it be just a random jumble. My goal was to basically not save anything out, to just put everything into this and get all of the most interesting aspects that, as I was telling you before, like I walk around and my colleagues walk around with this knowledge like busting out of our brains all the time. And it bugged me like on a very like visceral level. I would look at people out on the street and then I would think that person doesn't even know who our ancestors are.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
do. Like I know
Yeah.
scientifically who started our lineage. And that's unfair. Like I don't like that
Uh-huh.
at all. They should know that. They have a right to know that. I mean, the public paid for this work too.
Right.
It's they need to know
Exactly.
it. And I think it's very enriching to know it. So that's really the motivation. Writing a book is hard, especially if you're not really a writer. I mean, I write my scientific journal articles, but
Right.
one way I wrote this book is that it's hard to break out of the way we write as scientists, which is very hard to understand if you're not in our field. And so I would write a chapter in sort of science speak, and then I would just go back and just destroy it and break it
Hmm.
down and de-jargonify it and make it more fun and try to find analogies for things. Because I think that's, if you can find the perfect analogy for a hard concept, then you've really got it.
Absolutely. And then that's also a place where having professional editors, but also, I guess, unprofessional editors, friends and
Oh, yeah.
family members and folks, it's just so helpful to have somebody hold up a mirror and say, I know you think that you made that accessible, but this
Yeah.
sentence here makes no sense.
It's amazing how you just can't do that for yourself. So this
Right.
was definitely, and both of my TED Talks too, those are sort of my three big products that are meant for everyone. And I have just, in the process of making all three of those things, anyone who is willing to listen, I would like read them chapters of my book and get feedback or recite my TED talk to them and have them give me feedback.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Have your students read your book?
It's not out yet,
Right.
but they're all dying to read it, and they've all my students have contributed to this book.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, of course, because obviously it's like a research laboratory, as you mentioned earlier. There are these individual kind of threads or areas of inquiry that all contribute to a larger understanding. And so this is knowledge that's always, I guess, growing. That must be one of the toughest parts as a scientist who chooses to write something for public consumption. Is it sort of like, okay, at this point in time, we cannot wait for that next, the results of that next study. We cannot wait to figure, it's like, we just got to talk about it as we know it to be,
Yeah.
knowing that it will be different in a month and a year and 10 years.
I think psychologically something that I do that's very healthy about that is that I am not concerned about being wrong.
Right.
Just personally, I've just decided that I enjoy finding out that I was wrong because it's that much more of an increase of knowledge. So if I wrote everything that's right today, it's to the best of my knowledge in this book, but tomorrow it could all be wrong or obviated by something bigger, and that's fine. I'm fine with that.
It's 100% fine. And I feel like if we, from a sociocultural values perspective, adopted that more, I think it is the ethic or the ethos of the scientific community in general. But I do worry that from a kind of American sort of manifest destiny, rugged individualism perspective, and then combined with the political landscape, which is, okay, another election in 2 years, another election in 4 years, just got to kind of make something relevant for right now. And if I'm wrong, I just got to double down and pretend I was never wrong. It's just such a dangerous approach that gets reinforced by the structures that we've built up around it. And it makes it, I think, so that the public struggles to understand, we talk about mask mandates or any sort of example where it's like, well, but you were wrong. And it's like, no, we were right with the information we had at the time.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I mean, that's sort of a domain I don't really know much about. I just have to do what I do and try to do the best at what I do.
And I think influencing publicly, like doing what you do, doing the best at what you do, but also doing it in a way that is, just like you said, not apologizing for being wrong, recognizing when we learn more and our theories start to shift and change, that we verbalize that and say, this is what we knew back then because these were the limits of our tools. Yeah. And now that we have this new world opened up to us, we've learned that it's not quite like we thought it was. The more we do that, I think, in a public arena, and we do it with sort of like grace and we do it with humility, the more hopefully we're slowly influencing that conversation.
Yeah, that would be lovely. I hope what you just said comes to pass. I feel great.
And I think it is in small ways, but it becomes much harder when the, landscape where the power structures are is directly, I guess, antithetical to that, or is putting pressure not to be that. And so I guess you keep going and you fight and you do what you can as long as you can.
Yeah, that's basically it. And just sort of that's it. I don't think I have anything more to add about that. It's important to me in this book and in all my public representations of scientists is that, to show sort of how collegial science can really be. Competition's fine. There's nothing wrong with competition. Is definitely breeds progress for sure. But we also, there are many, many instances of just healthy competition and collaboration and collegiality that maybe don't play as well in the Hollywood films, that don't come across, when you think about a really innovative scientist who's doing amazing work, you maybe don't think of them as being really good friends with everybody they're competing with. But that's actually
and because competition is defined, I think, differently in the sciences.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe you're in a different lab and maybe you want to be first to publish, or maybe you want to, I don't know, maybe it would be nice if the work was recognized, even though it usually doesn't get recognized until years and years later.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the real goal is to learn stuff.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
And if you keep your focus on that, then even if you get beat, and I've lost these competitions as much as I've won them, even when you get beat, it doesn't bother you so much because you know that information was gained.
Right. And that these colleagues that sort of quote beat you for the funding or whatever they're also doing something really
And
important. And ultimately you're going to be citing their work anyway.
Yeah, that it's all part. Basically, your competitor's successes enrich you as well, and that's kind of
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So I'm curious before, I've already kept so much of your time, but I'm curious, are there open-ended questions in the book? Are there things that you are continuing to wonder and hope, or maybe are optimistic will be answered within, the span of your career we just don't know yet?
We're still looking for those extraterrestrials.
Yeah,
I
true.
mean, that would be huge. I've heard people discussing like, would we care if we found an alien and it's a microbe? Like, yes, we would care.
Of course we would care.
Of course we would care. That would be amazing.
And if we did find, an extraterrestrial microbe, I know you can't predict what it would look like or how it would work or if it had a metabolism like the microbes that you study, but getting the N to be larger than 1, having a true example, a studyable example of an extraterrestrial microbe, how do you foresee that impacting the work that you do on intraterrestrials?
I mean, I think that every big group of life that we've discovered has changed our understanding of how life interacts with its surroundings. So, I talk a lot in the book about how it looks like these things are bending thermodynamic rules, they're bending the rules of life, but they're not. They just show us that the limits are so much broader than what we thought before. And so if we discover something in the oceans of Europa, then I am certain that whatever it is and whatever it's doing, it's going to bust that wall even further.
Oh, that's a really cool way to look at it. Like it's a wider, I guess, berth. Whereas, we almost think of it as, that's abnormal. But no, when we think about evolution, I guess, or we just think about change and growth, it's narrowing. Mm-hmm. Like that's the whole point. But we're looking at it with a hindsight perspective.
Yeah.
We're going, this is where we are now because this was ultimately where we were going to get to. And it's like, no, we did not get here by some design. It just happened that way.
It just happened that way. And because it exists and because we find it, whatever the new thing is, that now shows us that our area is bigger than we thought it was. Like,
by definition, it has to be broader.
I can tell you quite honestly that a requirement for life is DNA. Okay, that can't be true. But everything we know is alive has DNA. And so it would be great if we could find an extraterrestrial that doesn't have DNA. And then we'd be like, there you go. We didn't think you had to have DNA. And there's the proof.
Yeah, that would be so freaking cool.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. So tell me, is there anything, there's a million things, but is there anything that sticks out to you that you covered, or that you want to whet people's appetite with in the book that we didn't even get close to?
I don't know. It's all depending on the time of day. I'm thinking about one aspect of it. But
I always try to get the big kind of conceptual stuff without a lot of the details, because that's the point of reading the book, is that you can get all those lovely details.
Yeah, no, I think it really, for me, knowing that things can be alive for potentially 1 million years is mind-blowing and changes a lot of how I think about biology and how I think about evolutionary pressure.
Oh, yeah. It changes how I think about myself as an organism. It's absolutely fascinating. I have to say, I'm so grateful, not just for the work that you do, but for doing the thing that it's a really hard thing to do, to say, okay, this work that I am doing and that my incredible students are doing matters. And even though my colleagues can see why it matters, a lot of people on the street are not even aware of it. Here is how I can maybe help them learn about it. I think it's great. And I'm really grateful that you took the time to do it, because it probably wasn't easy.
Well, thank you for saying that. And thank you for giving me extra opportunities to talk about it on your podcast. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's been an absolute joy having you here. Everybody, the book is Intraterrestrials, Discovering the Strangest Life on Earth by Dr. Karen G. Lloyd. Thank you again. And thank you everybody for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.